Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you might find yourself, particularly on the planet right now. We want to welcome you. This is the 10th annual forum from the Business Call to Action. And in this session, we're going to talk about reimagining resilience through inclusive business innovation. Um, I am Jason Teeters with SecondMuse, Program Manager with SecondMuse. I'm super excited for our conversation today with our founder and co-CEO, Todd Khozein. But before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things that I want to talk through. Number one, we want this to be interactive. So if you see yourself on the left, if you click on your name, there's a place where you can start a private chat if there's anybody you want to talk to, or you can change your status. And you can set your status as undecided, confused. I hope that you hit applause and happy a lot through this session. But that's where you can do that. As well as I want to encourage you to use the chat. The chat is a great place for you to put your information in. We're going to ask you to please participate throughout our conversation today. And as you put things in the chat, I'll do my best to elevate those questions and thoughts so we can have proper discussions around some of the things that may pop up. And with that said, I am super excited to introduce Todd Khozein. He's the founder and co-CEO of SecondMuse, an impact and innovation company building resilient economies by supporting entrepreneurs and the ecosystems around them. And so, Todd, I will let you go ahead and kick this off.
Thanks so much, Jason, and thank you so much all for joining and showing up. A special thanks to the UNDP team that's been driving this. So as Jason said, that we support entrepreneurs and the ecosystems that surround them, and we do this with the way that we call that is that we refer to it as economies of the future. And there is there's this idea that has been prevalent in economic theory, and this idea is that economies need to grow, but it needs to come at the cost of something, and the cost of that something oftentimes ends up being social justice or environmental justice. And so I'm sure many, if not most of you are familiar with this concept, but the thinking goes, you have to build your house, which is important, but you need to cut down the forest. And in that case, the forest is the unfortunate yet necessary consequence of the growth of the economy. We see, we really believe that this idea of the negative externality, meaning that economic growth needs to come at this cost, is actually a design flaw. It's a flaw of thinking that we've enshrined at the altar of our economic thinking for far too long. And as a matter of fact, we believe that when you design an economy with these types of costs, you're actually undermining the very foundation of that economy. And so by definition, you're not creating a strong economy or a resilient economy, but you're creating quite a vulnerable economy. And so let's not assume that social injustice or environmental injustice are a necessary cost. As a matter of fact, we believe that they are the brick wall that our economy is crashing into in many parts of the world right now. So as we design for a future, that design of the future, by definition, must require human environmental sustainability. And I think that this is the premise that we start. And this is really relevant to the notion of resilience. The team was sharing that this idea of COVID or the pandemic has come up in almost every conversation because it's a truly global human experience. All of us are being affected from this in some way or another. And one of the really unfortunate sort of biological realities of this virus is that weaker constitutions are affected more severely than stronger constitutions. So if you have an underlying medical condition, if you're older, if you have problems with with your breathing, you're going to be a lot more vulnerable and you're going to be affected more severely by this virus. Not dissimilarly, when you think about the economic body a strong economic body is able to be more resilient, meaning bounce back, just like it would be from a virus. And there's certain things that make an economy stronger, and there's certain things that make an economy weaker. There's certain things that make a business stronger. There's certain things that make an economy weaker. And again, these types of strength happen at multiple levels. And so while, as Jason said, we support entrepreneurs, and we take hundreds of entrepreneurs with real businesses, supporting them with concrete steps like, you need to, the insult of a global pandemic, when people aren't going out, there needs to be real adaptation that happens at the business level, meaning that, we need to digitize our services. We need to think about, revenue models differently. Perhaps we need to think about, accessing finance, short-term finance, to sort of carry a lot of businesses over. And while these are really real realities, there are some communities and some economies that are going to do this more effectively than others. And so we would like to simultaneously speak to the multiple levels of resilience, which is really the way that we work sort of across our programs. We help the ventures, but always within the context of the social economic reality within those ventures are actually operating, because the two of them coexist and really influence each other. So over the course of the next 50 or so minutes that we have together, what we're going to be trying to do is both offer some concrete insights, again at the micro level, but a little bit more at the macro level. But we're also going to be going through a process that embodies the way that we actually strive to create resilience in the economies in which we operate. And so we're going to ask you to sort of, and we may point to some of the things that we are doing and the way that we are doing this. And a key part of this is going to be making the intangible more tangible, and that's a role that you're going to see Jason playing, and he's a master at this. And so pay close attention to not only what he's saying, but how he's saying it and how he's doing it as well over the course. So maybe Jason, maybe you can kick us off for the session.
Thank you so much, Todd, for starting us off. I'm sure for a lot of you, you're like, all right, let's dive into this conversation. And so one of the things I want to do before we dive in, I think culturally speaking across SecondMuse, we understand that a lot of times we're having these really engaging conversations, and we're jumping from conversation to conversation and solving problem by problem. And so one of the ways we like to enter into a space is really just making sure we're grounded. And so I'm going to ask you for a brief moment to spare with us. We like to do what we call a mindful minute. And before we start in any space, we want to make sure that we prepare. It's sort of like if you're used to pre-COVID going to a meeting, you'd have that moment where you would park your car and walk up to the building and you sort of set yourself for the event. This is sort of like what we're doing here. So we ask for you to just find a nice, comfortable space that you're sitting at right now. Make sure your feet are flat on the ground. And just for a minute, I want you to just concentrate on your breath and just take some time. So we'll start that now, and I'll bring us back once it's over. So welcome back. I'm sure if you haven't done that in a while, you're like, man, I didn't know a minute was that long. So what I would ask you to go through right now is sort of just these shared agreements. And so, like Todd said, we really love engaging. As we're building ecosystems, we're always trying to elevate all the voices in the community. And so a lot of that takes some really design effort to make sure that we're getting to that. And so a couple of things that I would say. One, let's honor the experience, journey, and wisdom and humanness of each participant. Everybody on this call right now has been trying their best to impact their community, their environment in some way. And so let's make sure we recognize that and allow that in this space. Also, let's use the tools and resources available to create community. We really ask that if you feel like it, we would love for you to come off and share your screen, right? We love connecting with people. And so if that's something that you can do, we'd love for you to do that. If not, we completely understand. And then we can disagree while holding each other with compassion and respect. And I think this is a big thing that we've seen even with COVID, but prior to COVID. How do we create spaces where we all are able to respect each other and still have these heartfelt conversations about what we're trying to attempt to have? And then let's hold our deeply held beliefs as our own and not universal, right? There's so many things that we have to add to this space. And so it's so beautiful to have people here to add to that. And so sometimes that requires us to push and pull against our own thoughts. And lastly, let's have fun, right? So I've been fortunate enough to work at the grassroots levels with entrepreneurs, and there's something about an entrepreneur, or even an ecosystem, when they start to have that momentum, where they feel really passionate and excited about what they're creating. And so we offer this next 45 minutes or so with you to think like that. Like, let's be really passionate and creative about how we think about resilience, how we apply that to our own personal space, our business, our environment, and being able to share that. And so without further ado, I would love to just dive right in. Todd, if you could, we'd love to start with you. Resilience, right? Tell us about it. What's the first place we should start when we think about resilience?
Thanks, Jason. Yeah. So when I think about resilience at its basis, I think about the ability to come back and bounce back. But when I think about what allows for the bounce back, I think about multiple levels of resilience, right? I think about my own psychological resilience as an individual. And I think about times when I've been more fragile, or times when I felt I've been able to take more on. I think about the resilience at an organizational level. For example, I think about resilience at the SecondMuse level. How are we as an entity or a business able to withstand different changes and chances in the economy? I think about resilience in a community level. As a community, when we struggle for something, how likely are we to completely fall apart, or how likely are we to come together and sort of innovate more? And I think about resilience as a social level. One of the things that COVID has exposed is the fragility of economies around the world. And so I think also at that level. So that's one of the big things that I think about, is the multiple levels of resilience and how they interact with each other.
I love that, Todd. And so, I think a lot of times we talk about this, right? When you're looking at it in all those levels, sometimes it can be challenging if you don't have sort of some intention behind it. And so I really want to take this moment for everybody in the room, like, let's start to think about, what does resilience mean to each of us? And so I'll share this little slide with you that really asks the question, right? Resilience. Oh, I don't know why I can't see the question. Sorry about that. How do you define resilience? And so I'd love to give you a second in the chat. Just take a moment and tell us, how do you define resilience? What does resilience mean to you, your business, your individual self, or your organization? And if you don't know me, I'll sit here and wait till we start putting it in the chat. I like that. Bounce back, weather storm. I like that, Karen. Being in for the long haul and adjusting to adversity. And so, Todd, I want to share this with you, and I think I shared it with you before, but I think this would be a great way to really sort of like finish this conversation about this intentional design resilience, but I found this quote that said, "We aren't all in the same boat. We're all in the same storm. Some of us are in a yacht, a boat, a canoe, and some of us can't swim." So as you think about resilience, right, and we've seen sort of the negative effects from, right, the challenges with health to economic, and then the gaps that we've seen in systematic ability to be able to find funding, be able to grow and scale. So as you think about resilience and this idea of diversity, inclusion, can you give us some thoughts about how that relates?
Yeah, I think that I think that that's a I think that that's a fantastic question, right? Because I think that oftentimes, you know, I think oftentimes, you know, the multiple levels of resilience, as we start to think about the multiple levels of resilience, we also have to think about this not as multiple levels of, but of an entire spectrum, often which we can be on different ends of the spectrum. And if you think about a group of the human family, and remember, like you know, oftentimes in large narrative social science, we sometimes oppress, you know, entire members of the human family for centuries and call it progress or call it success. And I think that systematic, intentional, you know, frameworks and structures that have ultimately led to sort of oppression puts somebody not in a yacht, not in a boat, not in a canoe, but possibly not being able to swim. And so I think that as we think about resilience as well, it's not just this idea of business adaptability. Sometimes it's about having the mental space for that business adaptability. And I think that this exercise that you took us to at the beginning was let's just take a minute, was this idea of presence. And I think that that's why when we think about what a business needs, sometimes it's just a minute to breathe. Sometimes it's just space to actually have the decision. And so oftentimes we need to think when we're helping small businesses or when we're helping businesses, some of them may be, hey, here's an opportunity for a loan. Other times it may be an opportunity to get a minute to get your head out of the operations of desperate survival so that you can even think about your response to be able to actually get some kind of a loan. And I think that without thinking about the spectrum over there, you end up in situations like we did in the United States, where there was a paycheck protection program, but almost no Black-owned businesses actually received any of it. And I think that this is when you start to see that the structures and the processes and the financial mechanisms need to be grounded in the individual realities as well. Or if not, we are possibly inadvertently going to be continuing patterns of inequality instead of actually addressing them. And these are the types of moments where we actually have an opportunity to do the opposite.
Oh, he went off. You went off. I think you finished it up. I saw you went off mute there for a second, Todd, but I think we got you.
Yeah.
So I love that. So one of the things, right, that you mentioned, Todd, that was really interesting was like sort of this idea of giving us space to look up and sort of figure out where we need to go. And I think as we think about resilience, right, and we try to figure out how to be courageous and how to move forward, a lot of times, right, like how do we shine a light and what do we know, like the direction to go? And so one of the things that I wanted the group to sort of help me with sort of figuring this out is around this idea of defining what does a good resilience response look like, right? So what are some key components of building a resilient business? So I'd love for you to think about that and put your thoughts in the chat. And the things that I'm thinking about that I really want Todd to sort of speak to is this idea of we've seen over the last 5 or 6 months companies, organizations, communities that really had a tough time facing resilience. But then there was these moments where we saw individuals and companies and organizations really do some unique things, right? They really were able to pivot. They were able to future-proof their business. They were able to find ways to sort of navigate this tough terrain. And so as you start to think about some of the things that businesses or individuals or yourself may be incorporated to deal with this, I'd love for you to throw it in the chat. And so we can sort of have this discussion about how do we think about resilience and then how do we define sort of our North Star of getting there? And so, Todd, I'll leave. Oops, let me cancel that. So I'll leave that with you, Todd, where I would love to sort of get your thoughts about how do we define that, right? So Shelley said learning and keeping track and talking through learning, speaking about it and learning, agility, nimbleness, ability to pivot, right? So how do companies think about the resources and capabilities they have, and how do they use them?
Yeah, and I think that the business call to action team actually did some research where they had a survey asking this question, and there were some really interesting insights that were there, and I'm going to speak to some of them. I mean, one of the thing is where they actually go. I mean, there was a juxtaposition, and I know that the team on there, you can correct me if I get this wrong, but there was something like 69%, if I'm not mistaken, around there, didn't know about government resources to help them at the venture level, but something like 56 or so percent said that the place that they go to find resources is actually the community that we actually go over there. And I wanted to pick out something that Andre said, which is speaking about it and learning. And I think that this is one of the components of building a resilient business are you willing, if I'm in a situation, and we find this throughout our programming a lot, if I'm in a situation where I feel that I'm not safe enough to be able to sort of expose my weaknesses because it's going to be taken advantage over there, then I'm not going to expose my weaknesses. And when I do not expose my weaknesses or say my needs, then I am never going to be in a position to find somebody that ultimately is going to help me with those needs. And so you start seeing, and this is something that we've seen a lot, is the notion of trust playing a critical component to resilience of a business, not in kind of like theoretical or ideological ways, but in incredibly concrete ways. So if I actually am surrounded by a group of people, and I think that it was Luciana who mentioned something up here. Yeah. So she said that resilience is the capacity to believe that you are capable to overcome difficulties despite adversities. And especially when you couple this with Carrie Freeman, my dear and far more capable co-CEO, talking about maintaining grace through the difficulties. You're talking about this thing that is normally not considered hard business speak, right? Which is this idea of trust. But at the end of the day, if my ability to trust that I'm being taken care of, and my ability to trust that if I expose my needs and vulnerability, I will not be taken advantage of, if that is ultimately going to be the most powerful thing that's going to allow me to help adapt my business to a reality that I might not fully understand, to be access to financial resources that I might not actually know are there. And so this is, I think, one really concrete interaction whereby the resilience of a business is intimately connected with its relationship to the community vis-a-vis other businesses or other things like that. So I think that that's one really ability. Dana talked about agility, nimbleness, and the ability to pivot. And I think that what defines our ability to pivot, what defines our nimbleness? I mean, as an entrepreneur, or when you're the owner of a small business, you know everything that you know about your world, but you might not know what you need to know to be able to digitize a business that you've provided in person all these different times. And so the ability to be able, you can either spend 5 years learning about how to do that, or you can access somebody else's insights. But again, access to knowledge and access to insights presupposes a relationship. And so I think that when we start to build business ecosystems and economy, if there's relational poverty, even in the presence of material wealth, it's going to be irrelevant, because we are being affected by so many different insults, as it were, be they environmental challenges, a hurricane, or I'm calling you from Portland, Oregon, where we had the world's worst air quality for a week running and nobody could leave their house. Who would have anticipated that this would have happened in a place that normally has the cleanest air in the world? And so I think that that's something that we're starting to see. One thing that Anissa talks about is being able to tap a multiplicity of voices and experience. And I think that this is she mentions a complex reality. I mean, the nature of a complex reality is that we can't possibly understand it ourselves. And so this idea that you can even anticipate a future which has not come and might come at you all of a sudden is kind of ridiculous to think in anyways. And so I think that these are some of the key businesses and components that we're starting to see.
So, Todd, I know you've been doing this for over a decade now with SecondMuse, and so I would love, as you mentioned, a couple key components of that. Is there any real world examples, right? What are some of the things that I know, some of the programs that we've worked on now, but like in a couple of the programs that really speak to this sort of uh, trajectory or sort of this response in these times?
Yeah, there's a really good example. As a matter of fact, I'm seeing a couple of my colleagues who work out of our New York office, and we have been spending the last 6 years or so building helping to develop an advanced manufacturing economy. One of the key design principles that we've had over there is that advanced manufacturing, which is notoriously exclusive as an industry. There's not a very good investment framework, so you need money to get in. It's incredibly male. It tends to be incredibly white. I mean, it's a very privileged type of industry. But for 6 years, the team on the ground over there has been actively working to change the culture and the composition around, and in the process, creating a lot of relationships among the manufacturing economy, sort of as it stands in New York. Well, one of the things that we saw when COVID hit was the evaporation of the personal protective equipment supply chain. So all of a sudden, these masks and gowns and everything that were mostly being manufactured in China, all of a sudden, when there's a global demand over there, we started seeing, and if, as some of you may know, New York was the first major hotspot in the United States to really be hit by this, and we didn't have. I mean, we literally didn't have personal protective equipment, and so the team convened and chaired a task force that was dedicated to finding and supplying personal protective equipment. Now, there is no reason that a company like SecondMuse should be operating in a space that is a highly specialized supply chain for a very specific industry without having done that. But the way that we were able to adapt to provide real value over there was just because we had relationships, was because we had so much trust in relationships, and so we had access to manufacturers across the world, as well as manufacturer networks sort of from within New York, that we were able to mobilize and to adapt, which was an incredible adaptation, both of the local manufacturing economy as well as of the ability to all of a sudden source from places that they may not have sourced, especially for hospitals and medical institutions.
I love that. And so maybe we could take a layer above that. So if you're an organization or someone that's looking to fund, right, an ecosystem like that, how do you find, right, those groups? Like, how do they make those connections from the top level, sort of looking for that?
One of the things that I think is really useful is designing community and designing relationship into the transactions. Oftentimes, when transactions are being created, we ultimately starve the relationship. Now, every opportunity is an opportunity to build relational infrastructure underlying an economy. So if you think about research, for an example, research can be one-on-one conversations where analysis happens in a black box and then a report is shared. Research can also be a collective experience that ultimately emphasizes and develops and builds the strong bounds of the community. And I think that as we think about 21st century's economies who are rapidly adapting. I mean, we are living in an era where we are building more built infrastructure than we ever have in the past. We also simultaneously are living in an era where we're going to experience some of the most aggressive climate, certainly in modern history, that we're seeing. In this kind of a thing, we need to think about infrastructure not just being physical infrastructure, but being relational infrastructure, because it's the relational infrastructure that's going to adapt. So as we think about procurement processes, as we think about contracting, as we think about business relationships, as we think about funding mechanisms, let's put the layer, just like we think about, hey, am I excluding certain people by creating this financial mechanism, or am I including certain people? Asking the question is a very powerful thing. And so by asking, how are we enhancing and enforcing relational infrastructure, even through my business practices, even if I'm a small business, or even if I'm a medium-sized business, even if I'm a government, even if I'm a foundation that's, or a multilateral agency, I can put this layer of, is this series of activities or are these actions increasing relational strength? Because it doesn't have to come at the cost of value. As a matter of fact, I would argue just about everything from a research standpoint, from a procurement standpoint, from an analysis standpoint, from a deployment standpoint, benefits if you incorporate a relational component into it from a strictly KPI perspective. And so I think that that's something concrete that, regardless of where we sit in an ecosystem, we can bring it front and center in our minds.
I love that. And so this is really interesting conversation, because I think we've talked about this in the SecondMuse as we're building communities, right? It's sort of that conversation of like, how do you build community? And I think a lot of the things that we land on is we sort of want to move with like our core strengths, right? Like, what are the things that really value, like that we bring to the world that other individuals need? And so one of the first things I love to get feedback from the group, Todd, and then have you sort of expand on that, is this idea of, as we think about being a resilient business and living in a resilient economy and having a resilient organization, a couple of things is that we've noticed from those that have been really resilient, they really leaned in to the thing that they did well. And so, as the group here, I'd love to find out from you, right? What are some of the key component? Sorry about that. The next question that I'd love to find out for you is what challenge would people call you to solve, right? I think in the BCTA forum has said, here's what I can provide, here's what I'm looking for. And I think a lot of times being able to understand the problems that individuals solve can help us really build strong relationships, because we know, like, I'm going to reach out to you because you have this thing that I really need help with. And so instead of me trying to exhaust my time, resources, right, I want to connect with people. And so I ask you to just take a second, if you can, and if you were a superhero, right, so to speak, like, what problem would people call for you to solve? And I just want you to throw it in the chat real quick. And so as we're waiting for people to throw that in the chat, Todd, it's sort of the reason why I wanted to sort of move down this path is because I think a lot of the work that I've seen us do that's been really fantastic, and we've seen businesses, organizations, and communities changes around this ability to bring their whole self, right? To completely bring every part of them to this idea and really make it work. And so I would love to get your thoughts, right, of this idea of how do we, as entrepreneurs, as leaders, as a CEO, right? Like, you weathered some of this storm as well, right? Like, how do you bring your whole self when it almost seems like the world and the environment is unstable?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jason. The other thing that I maybe like to call out is we're starting to see some of the comments in the chats. Here's an example that I want to call back and show the process of what Jason is doing before we get to the points, right? So this is a really important question that he's asking the group. He's asking you, what can you bring to the table? What can you do that's actually amazing? But you also will recognize that, we're trying to simulate in 15 minutes what normally we would do over the course of months or over the course of a year, right? So you're noticing that there's a path of like, hey, let's be present. Hey, what do you think about the foundational ideas we're talking about? There's almost some like a ground setting. Are we even on the same planet here? Oh, we are. How interesting. We're starting to generate ideas about something that, and it's only after there's some trust that's been established. There's only after there's some relation. There's some people. Anissa makes a comment and Andre laughs about it and sort of in the chat. There's only when you start to see some. And, these are symbols of trust that are actually happening. Now I know a lot of these relationships may be longstanding and established. But when you start to see the development of trust, that's when you ask, hey, what do you need? Because when you ask, what do you need, into a void with no relationships, with no cold, how many people are going to immediately expose their vulnerability to a questionnaire? Especially if it's something that they really need, and especially it's something that if their funders knew about it, they might not fund them. And so I think that this is also I just wanted to call out the process of something to do, which is like, there are certain times when data and information will simply not be accessible to you, which makes it impossible for you to actually make the right decision unless you have done the actual work on the ground of creating some of the social context and some of the social capital and the relational capital that you're sort of going on the ground. And I think that this is when we start to say, yeah, I mean, there is, hey, if we actually, there was a comment that I think Anissa might have made up there, which talked about spontaneously reorienting without needing a centralized authority to tell us what to do. I mean, this is, the idea that we're going to elect one person and that one person is going to be a deciding authority to take us into an unknown world that we have literally never seen before is kind of insane. I mean, the idea that Jason and I are going to tell this group of people on the call, we're sharing guidance and advice, but the entire structure of this call is asking you, what do you think? Because if we were just relying on what we think and our insights, we're basically sacrificing the majority of the value that's actually coming to the table right now. And so I think that as we start to develop a much stronger infrastructure as such, the current structures that we have are not designed for resilience. They're not designed for adaptation. But we won't be able to take our governance models and our other models into a brave new world without a fundamentally different and new infrastructure. And I think that that's one of the things that we keep emphasizing, is that there's a new type of infrastructure that we're talking about, which is a relational infrastructure that we think will give you access to understanding, because in an unknown world, you might have a superpower that was not a superpower yesterday, but all of a sudden you might have a key insight to the future that I would not know that unless we actually have access both to each other's fears as well as to each other's strengths. And so that becomes an essential part in building a truly healthy economy. And again, we're not talking about gooder economies. This is not a humanitarian appeal. This is like a be intelligent kind of appeal. Like, let's not be dumb. Like, let's recognize that a smart economy is one that actually that is inclusive. So it's more about fundamentally effective economies rather than appealing to humanitarian, appealing to somebody's nobility in this case. So in many ways, the crises and the challenges that we're facing, and we were talking a little bit about this before the call started, the crises that we're like, what is the biggest thing that's going to take us out of, something like a pandemic? It's unity. It's a unified approach. Like, it's no mystery what you need to do. But if only 20% of the population is going to social distance or wear masks, or only 40% of the population or whatever, then absence of unity, you simply can't find a solution. So it's almost like the nature of these challenges are such designed that taking a siloed approach, you won't even understand it, let alone be able to effectively address these things. And this is a key notion when we think about business resilience and economic resilience, even at the very micro level, which is the unit of the venture.
I love that, Todd. And a couple, right, I'll let you sort of decide. I would love to get your thoughts on projects maybe that we've been involved in that sort of explain that out, right? I think, like, top of mind, I think of Headstream, I think of the Git project, right? But I'm sure some of the stuff we're doing over in Sarbai, like, those may be more particular to this conversation. But I'd love to get your thoughts on an example of how that's sort of been done, either by us or by other institutions or organizations you've supported.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so give a couple examples. I mean, one of the examples that's coming up, there's a program that we have that we run with Pivotal Ventures. It's called Headstream. And if we think about the internet was designed with a specific business model, or the internet lives, I'll say right now, with a specific business model which monetizes relationships. And so all of our social platforms or anything out there, the business models of the business models online, because they're largely driven by advertising business models, ultimately look to monetize the relationship. Now, what this means is that relationships are influenced in a way that ultimately increase monetization. These online and digital spaces were not designed for human thriving. And what we see is that we see this to be really problematic, especially in the era of COVID, because it's not, we've been seeing this with our young humans for a while, right? Where you see everything from loneliness and depression, all the way to the tragic end of the more tragic end of the spectrum, talking about adolescent suicide, we are seeing dramatic increases in numbers of these things. But right now, we're all online. I mean, grandma's online. Your aunt that could never figure out Facebook is online. I mean, everybody is. I mean, because we're all socially isolated, and we're going online to a digital space that wasn't designed for human thriving in place. Now, the social cost of an absence of human thriving is immense. I mean, when you think about the relationship which loneliness and depression leads to performance in school, leads to performance in the workplace, leads to the cost is tremendous, to institutions, organizations. And so, that's an example, and we have we're currently doing a call for innovations, for example, where that specifically is in mind. Specifically the development of ventures that are looking at digital spaces. One of the other brief comments is in Singapore and throughout South and Southeast Asia, we're working through our Incubator Network to specifically build appropriate infrastructure for waste management. And in this case, we're working very closely with the informal sector. We're working, with the waste pickers, with the, with the aggregation facilities, as with the investment funds and with the governments. And when you start thinking about, okay, let's create a coherent economy that doesn't make environmental justice and social justice and economic growth and investment capital be competing interests, but instead starts to line these things up. When you start to blend them in a way that lines it up, pools of capital that previously were in opposition can now de-risk each other, and so we can start to think about new markets in very different ways. And this allows for voices that may have been buried before now to have a critical role in the development of our economic systems.
Yeah, and I love it. I don't know if you take a chance to. I don't know if you saw Karen's comment about not everyone's online because not all people can afford computers and internet, right? So I don't know if you want to take a moment just to address that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate that comment, and I think that's 100% right. And I think that this is when we see. I think that this is when we see how fundamental. I think that this goes back to the question around we're not all in a yacht. Some people are in a boat. Some people can't swim. And I think that this is a question of, there's also the reality that climate change is not affecting everybody equally, right? Because if you're in North America and you see the worst air quality in the world, you buy an air purifier and stay indoors and order from Amazon, and that's an incredible luxury that obviously is not, that is not afforded to everybody. So I really appreciate that comment.
I love it. And so in all of this, Todd, I've known you a while, and I wanted to do an activity that would sort of bring us all together, right? And sort of take everything that we've been sort of talking through and sort of create this sort of space of some fun, interactive, like feedback. And I picked one of your favorite poets, Rumi. And so I'm going to ask all of you to participate in this fun little exercise. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a poem to you, and I just want you to listen. And then I'm going to give you orders. I'm going to read it a second time, and I'm going to give you a different set of orders. So the poem is by Rumi, and it says, "There's a deep cave inside of you. Far back at the end of that cave is a brightly lit market square. Everyone has a deep friend and something that they love to do, a beloved and a craft. But this lively market in the far reaches of the cave within you is more amazingly hidden than anything you have yet found." Now I'm going to share this poem with you as I read it. And once I get done, I would love for you to write what you think the very next line of the poem would be. And you could just write it on a piece of paper or somewhere, scribble it on a pad next to you. So here goes. "There's a deep cave inside of you. Far back at the end of that cave is a brightly lit market square. Everyone has a deep friend and something that they love to do, a beloved and a craft. But this lively market in the far reaches of the cave within you is more amazingly hidden than anything you have yet found." And so I would ask, what would be the very next line of that poem? And you could write that on a piece of paper or keep it in your head for right now. And I'll give you a second to write. Now I'm going to read it one last time. And at the end of this one, I would love for you to take the line that you wrote and put it in the chat. So here we go. There is a deep cave inside of you. Far back at the end of that cave is a brightly lit market square. Everyone has a deep friend and something that they love to do. A beloved and a craft, but this lively market in the far reaches of the cave within you is more amazingly hidden than anything you have yet found. And when you get a second, I would love for you to type your line in the chat. Get the nervousness. Go ahead. You can put it in there. I'll give you like another 15 seconds. And so as people are typing, I'm going to go ahead and start. If you look at, I'll start with Karen at time marker 244. Karen says, what you are seeking is seeking you. We travel to it together. Just keep searching because you have looked in the wrong places. The search for this place is life. So why haven't you picked up the phone and called your sister today? Let's ignite your light together. Just trust the universe and wait for it to find you. And I love this. And I want you to sort of talk to this, Todd. But the reason why I did this, right? Here's like a perfect example of what we've sort of been talking about, this idea of coming into a space, right, with trust, with not knowing everybody's superpower. The lines keep coming in, right? And what we find is in these spaces, with very little information, with very little time, we were able to work together, come together, and create something that's unique and different, right? And some poem standards could even be beautiful, right? But as we think about our conversation today, Todd, right, and the idea of resilience and the concrete steps and the things that really help us get out of this, I would love for you to just sort of share back to us some of the things that sort of resonated with you as it relates to how we can today move forward in our business and our organization and as individuals and really support our community.
Yeah, there's this idea sometimes that community and compassion is not in in opposition of economic growth, but is something that requires grueling long-term effort, right? So we say, I mean, the reality is that we can take a lifetime just figuring out whether we're going to like somebody, and we can take another lifetime figuring out if we want to, to have a more committed relationship to somebody, right? Where we're going to grow together. We can also but a lot of this depends on where you want to start, right? So I think that this is, I don't know if the rest of you feel this way, but because of the different types of, when I look at the chat over there, I mean, in what business context have any of you shared poetry that is possibly an insight into the recesses of your soul? I mean, it's not a normal thing that we usually do because we oftentimes suck the relationship out of the transactions, because transactions without an intentionality don't allow the relationship to sort of come with it. And so there's we did we ran a challenge with the Rockefeller Foundation, specifically focused on the future vision of food systems, and we had 1,300 respondents. Now, each of these 1,300 respondents represents a public-private partnership, right? A city government and a foundation, maybe an academic institution, maybe a large regional corporation who was able to say, this is what we think the future of food is actually going to look like. And the only thing that we can say for certain is that the future is going to look nothing like the present. And so starting from a position of the present is almost a riskier proposition than starting from a position of the future. And this process of developing a social relational infrastructure, right? Even after 49 minutes in a simulated digital experience where many of us don't know each other, we are better set right now to work together to create something substantially better than if this would have been a transactional event where we would have read a PowerPoint presentation to you and shared the top 10 insights that make business more resilient in the future and asked you to fill out the survey at the bottom of the form and asked you to fill out whether you enjoyed the presentation or not. And so we put so many barriers in front of ourselves. Like if you start from a position of an assumption of mistrust and an assumption of relational poverty, you're setting yourself up for a lifetime of work. But if you start from the future, if you start from an emerging future where the community actually does exist, and you start in engaging that way, you're actually going to be able to advance and starts to build on things that would have been impossible to build on should you have done this before. And an example of this is I previously mentioned the FutureWorks work that we had done in New York. I mean, we're looking at 1 or 2% sort of rates of people of color or women in advanced manufacturing. But last year, 55% of our entrepreneurs were women or people of color. And so you can see, and this is just after 5 years, this type of dramatic change of culture and composition of an economy doesn't require even a generation if done with the right intentionality when we actually go over there. And so I think that oftentimes we limit the possibility of what can underlie an economy just because we don't allow ourselves to think, actually, we might be predisposed to work together and to trust each other, and that we just need the opportunity and the setup so that our procurements are not designed for mistrust, but instead our procurement mechanisms are designed for trust, so that our transactions are not designed for mistrust. And again, a lot of these have roots in the thinking of Homo economicus and economic thinking, right? If we think that humans are sinful and evil and they'll always do the worst thing and it's a dog-eat-dog world and it's going to be in it for themselves, then you're starting from a position of relational poverty. But if you think about actually we could start from a much more advanced place. There's a fundamental different position that we can get to. Again, when you're thinking about an individual transaction, maybe it puts you at risk, but we don't think about what we lose by sucking the relationship out of the transaction. Where what we have lost is exposed is at the moment of adaptability. When we're like, how are we going to adapt if I don't have anybody to talk to and I don't know who's going to do this? And I think, I've been working for years to compete with somebody else when actually there was a different framework that would have allowed me not only to have a more successful business, but also to be able to draw from their strengths and for them to be able to draw from mine, so that we can sort of go into a different future.
I love it. I love that. And I know we have just a couple minutes left. And so if you have any questions for Todd, throw them in the chat, because I'm sure he'd love to fire some back if you have anything around the work that we're doing or anything that he brought up during this conversation.
And I would actually show, in addition to questions, I'd love to hear insights that kind of game that maybe some of you have been thinking about this. I think that this would be a good moment to share some of the insights that some of you may have had specifically along the lines that we've been discussing. And again, they don't have to be agreement insights. They can be questioning insights. They can be a different proposition insights. They could be a question as well.
And I'd love for you to come off mute if you want to just say it out loud. You don't have to do the chat if that feels more comfortable to you.
While we're warming up, oh yeah, please, Sheila.
Yeah, I just wanted to share one reflection. So much of this conversation has been about, well, that now. I'm getting a FaceTime call and I'm distracted. I'm sorry. Glad. It's my mom. Love her. But yeah, so much of this conversation together here has been about relationships, and we've used various words, relational relationships, and having spent now going on 12 hours in this event, and seeing seeing the kind of common thread, this is the perfect way just to end. I'll be leaving this event after this, and this is the perfect way to end it in the perfect culmination of things that have been phrased in so many different ways today, and in more business speak, community engagement and partnerships. Those have been like the key things that I've seen all over the place today. And now we're bringing it here into these in a totally new words, but it just encompasses everything in such a beautiful and poetic way. So yes, thank you. And I think it's just a wonderful sum up to what we have been talking about all day and what we're here to talk about.
Thank you, Sheila. Anissa said, we are moving from competition with the established private sector to what feels like an attempt to seduce the private sector to do the right thing, e.g. achieve the SDGs. What does a truly collaborative, non-oppositional framing look like?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, Anissa, and I know that your big old brain has been thinking about stuff like this for a little while. I think the answer has to be driven by unprecedented collaboration. I think that the contributions to the economic frameworks that are ultimately going to live into the future has to have the fingerprint of humanity on it. And if it doesn't have the fingerprint of humanity on it, it's never going to serve the totality of humanity. And so I think that there's a design principle that we often use in our programs, right? Which is that if you're designing somebody, they better well be in the room. And I think that as we're thinking about these new economic frameworks, I think that part of what we're suggesting is a reimagination of the purpose of the private sector. I mean, if the private sector sole purpose is the generation of financial capital at the exclusion and at the expense of every other type of capital, then we have set up an impossible situation. But if we start to think that social justice and economic justice sits at the foundation of our economic activity, I mean, remember, if you look at the assumptions about the cost of COVID, they range from $3 trillion at the most optimistic to $80 trillion at their most pessimistic. If we look at the financial projections of the cost of climate change, we are talking about trillions of dollars a year in lost revenue. There's a study that Citibank just came out with, which the cost of racial oppression in the United States, they billed at 19 and change trillion dollars. I mean, that's, the GDP of the country is at 16 trillion. So I mean, this type of thinking can actually unlock substantially more than what it actually would cost as we start to think about it. So I think it's a very exciting conversation, and I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation, and it has to be a radically inclusive conversation at a level that we tend not to generally have conversations.
I love that, Todd, and we're going to have to break there. I know we're getting close to the finish line, but we've been able to steal another hour of Todd's time. And so in the chat, we dropped a little link. If you want to come by for casual coffee on a SecondMuse Zoom call, you can dig into more of the conversation that we talked about today, learn more about us, SecondMuse, and just really find out ways that we can impact our community. I know that I just want to say a big thank you for allowing me the opportunity to have this conversation with you, Todd. It's been a pleasure. And of course, I'll give you a minute to say your farewells as well.
Jason, will you tell us what the last line of the poem was?
Oh, there was no last line. That was literally the end of the poem. So you, as a community, you've all created the last line.
Basically, he's saying you're in the same camp of Rumi. Who knew?
Yeah, I did not take a line away. That was the full poem.
Rabel, I'm wondering if it's possible to save the chat. There
Yes.
was some absolute gold that was dropped in the chat.
If you take this 3 dots and says save, I'll just do it myself as well.
And I did it as well.
Perfect. And everything has been recorded, so we'll be sharing the video with you too.
Thank you so much. So appreciate all of your insights.
I kind of feel like this should go on for a bit, but I guess we're at the end of it. Well, so as I don't know if everybody noticed, but as Teeters said, that there is a Zoom link to Casual Coffee if you want to continue chatting with Todd and Jason and the whole SecondMuse team. Thank you so much, both of you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate
More energy at the end of the day than I started off with, so that's fantastic.
it. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.